The council chamber on Thren Prime had not trembled in 4,000 years, not since the Silicate Wars burned themselves out and the crystalline elders decreed that the galaxy would know peace through order, hierarchy, and the slow, patient math of species who measured their own lives in centuries. It trembled now, not from weapons, not from fire. It trembled because 73 lights had appeared in the tactical dome above the amphitheater. 73 lights that had not been there a heartbeat before, arranged in a formation that made no sense to any sensor grid in council space. Because nothing had approached, nothing had been detected crossing the dark, nothing had tripped a single one of the ancient listening arrays that had watched the void for 10,000 years. The ships were simply there, the way a decision is simply made, the way a verdict once spoken cannot be unspoken. And at the heart of that formation sat a vessel unlike anything the Council's cartographers had ever rendered. Black as the space between galaxies, its hull scored with lines of cold blue light that pulsed like something breathing, something patient, something that had waited 50 years to exhale. Commander Naomi Voss stood at the observation rail of that ship, her hands loose at her sides, her eyes on the swollen, jeweled disk of Thren Prime turning below her. And she did not smile, because her father had taught her that triumph worn on the face is triumph wasted, that the deepest victories are the quiet ones, the ones that need no applause because they simply are, the way a sunrise simply is, indifferent to whether anyone watches it happen. She was 41 years old. She had been 6 when the Council's judgment ships had herded her family and 11 million other human beings through a one-way gate and stripped every scrap of technology from their hands, down to the buttons on their coats, and left them on a cinder of a world at the ragged edge of nowhere with a single verdict ringing in their ears: too chaotic, too independent, unfit to walk among civilized species. Go, and do not return. They had not been given ships to leave in. They had not been given tools to build with. They had been given, in the Council's own dry, bureaucratic language, a proportionate and merciful sentence, commensurate with the threat posed. And for the first winter on that nameless gray world, which the humans would later name Ember, because Ember was the last warm thing they remembered, the sentence had felt like exactly what it was. A slow execution stretched out over generations, dressed up as mercy so the Council's conscience, if such crystalline things could be said to have won, would never have to look directly at what it had done. Naomi had not lived that first winter as an adult, but she had lived it as a child, which in some ways was worse, because children remember not the facts of hunger but the shape of it, the particular way their mother's hands felt thinner each week, the sound their father made when he thought no one was listening, a sound like a man trying to hold a door shut against something enormous on the other side. Her father, Ambassador Elias Voss, had stood before the Council on the day of the verdict and said the only thing history would remember him for saying: "You can take our cities, you can take our fleets, you can take every wire and every gear and every scrap of the world we built, but you cannot take the thing that built them. And one day you will have to answer for what you assumed that thing was." The Council had recorded his words as an emotional outburst, noted and dismissed. And then they had turned off the cameras, and the humans had been herded through the gate. And for 50 years the galaxy had gone on exactly as it always had, content in its certainty that the matter was closed, that a chaotic species without tools, without ships, without a shred of the technology that had let them rise so quickly and so alarmingly among the stars, would simply do what unsupported things do in the dark. It would fall, it would fade, it would eventually be forgotten, filed away in the Council's endless archive of cautionary tales, a footnote titled Homo sapiens, terminated by environment, case closed. The Council had been wrong in a way it would take them the rest of this day to fully understand, and Naomi Voss intended to make sure they understood it slowly, deliberately, and completely, because rage rushed and made mistakes, but patience, human patience, the kind her species had apparently invented a way to bottle and drink like water during 50 years in the dark. Patience did not rush anywhere. It arrived exactly when it meant to arrive, and it did not need to raise its voice. To understand what happened in the council chamber that day, you have to understand what happened on Ember in the years before it, because the story of humanity's return did not begin with ships or weapons or quantum equations rawled on cave walls by starving engineers. It began with something much smaller and much stranger. It began with the discovery, made within the first 6 months of the exile, that human beings, when given absolutely nothing, could still find a way to be furious about it. And that fury, properly channeled, is one of the most efficient fuels ever discovered by any species in any galaxy. Ember was not a world that wanted anything living on it. It orbited a dim red dwarf so far out on the galactic rim that its own star looked like a dying coal in a black hearth, casting a light so weak that even at local noon, the sky stayed the deep bruised purple of an Earth twilight. There was no breathable atmosphere worth the name, only a thin soup of nitrogen and carbon dioxide that the Council's judgment officers had calculated, with the same bloodless precision they applied to everything, would be survivable in the short term, pending adaptation or extinction, whichever occurs first. There was ice, deep in fissures and caverns that riddled the planet's crust like the burrows of some ancient extinct animal. And there was rock, endless gray rock, iron-heavy and cold. And there was absolutely nothing else. No seed banks, no tools, no shelters, nothing but 11 million human beings standing in the freezing dark, staring up at a sky that held no visible stars at all, because from Ember's position, wreathed in the light-scattering dust of the rim, the rest of the galaxy was simply gone, swallowed by distance, as if the universe itself had decided humanity no longer merited a view of anything beyond its own prison walls. It is worth pausing on that detail, because it became, in later human mythology, the single most quoted fact about the exile. For the first 11 years on Ember, no human being alive had ever seen a star. Not one. The children born in the caverns, in the burrow cities carved by hand and by desperation into the planet's frozen crust, grew up believing that stars were a story their grandparents told, a legend from the old world, no more provably real than a dragon or a god. And it was one of those children, a girl born in the third winter named Selene Ape, who would grow up to become the woman who first bent light itself around a piece of scavenged iron ore, and in doing so, would hand humanity the key to everything that followed. But that comes later. First, there was the surviving. Before any of that, though, there was the walk from the gate, and it is worth lingering on that walk, because the humans who lived through it never really stopped describing it, in one form or another, for the rest of their lives, the way survivors of any great catastrophe circle back, again and again, to the first hour, as if the first hour contains some essential truth that the years afterward only elaborate on. The gate had opened onto a plain of gray shale under a sky the color of a fresh bruise, and the Council's judgment officers, tall, faceted, entirely without malice in any way the humans could recognize, had simply withdrawn the platforms the exiles stood on, so that 11 million people fell in staggered waves over the course of 6 hours, the last distance from the gate's threshold to the ground, a fall of less than a meter. But a fall that every survivor remembered as the precise moment the old world ended and the new one, unannounced and unwelcoming, began. There had been no ceremony to it, no final word from the Council beyond the verdict already spoken decades of legal proceeding before. The gate simply closed, folding in on itself with a sound like a held breath finally released, and then there was only wind and shale, and 11 million people standing in small, stunned clusters, looking at each other, and at the horizon, and at a sky with no stars in it, trying to understand what exactly they were now supposed to do with the rest of their lives. The first year on Ember killed nearly 2 million people. Cold took some. Starvation took more. A strange native lichen, purple-black and slick as an oil slick, poisoned an entire settlement before anyone learned it could be scraped, boiled for 9 hours, and turned into something that, while it tasted like a memory of regret, could keep a human body alive. The Council, watching from a discreet, silent monitoring satellite they had left in high orbit, ostensibly for historical record-keeping purposes, but in practice to confirm the sentence was proceeding as expected, logged these deaths in a ledger with the same dispassion they logged crop yields on agricultural worlds. Expected attrition, the reports read. Model tracking within acceptable parameters. What the model did not track, because the model had been built by beings who had never needed to build one for themselves, was what happens inside a species that refuses to lie down. Around that monitoring satellite, unnoticed for years, a rumor began to circulate among the humans of Ember, passed hand to hand, mouth to ear in the freezing dark of the burrow cities. Someone is still watching us. And where a lesser species might have found that thought terrifying, the humans of Ember found it, in a strange and specific way, motivating. If someone was still watching, then someone would eventually have to see. And the humans of Ember decided, somewhere in that brutal first decade, with no vote taken and no declaration issued, simply because enough of them decided it separately and all at once, that when the Council finally did look again, properly look, they were not going to see a graveyard. They were going to see something the Council did not have a category for. The second decade was the decade of hands. With no metal to spare beyond what they clawed from the iron-rich rock with tools they made from other rock, the humans of Ember rebuilt the most basic elements of civilization, one aching, bloody-knuckled attempt at a time. They built kilns from packed clay and learned, through 11 separate catastrophic failures, how to fire ceramics hard enough to hold an ember, hence the world's name, spoken first as a bitter joke about their own condition, and adopted within a generation as a badge of pride. They built looms from bone and sinew, salvaged from the strange, hardy underground fauna that had adapted to Ember's darkness long before humans arrived. Six-legged, blind, patient creatures the settlers called groundwells for their slow, deliberate movement through loose soil. And from those looms came the first clothing that wasn't simply the tattered remains of what people had been wearing on the day of the exile. They built a calendar out of the tidal pull of Ember's 2 moons, because a species cannot plan a future if it cannot measure the distance between one day and the next, and planning a future, even a future that looked, by every reasonable measure, hopeless, was something the humans of Ember refused to stop doing. It was during this second decade that the first schools were built, and it is here that the story of the science begins in earnest, because the adults who had been exiled as adults, the doctors and engineers and physicists who had once designed starships and orbital habitats and the elegant, whisper-quiet reactors that powered old Earth cities, made a decision that would define everything that came after. They did not have the tools to build the technology they knew. They had, in many cases, only memory, equations half-remembered, principles understood but unbuildable without the machines that had once built the machines that built the machines. But memory, it turned
Business
out,
is an
is a kind of
economic activity
seed,
that
and
involves the
seeds do
exchange,
not need
purchase,
soil that
sale, or
looks like
production of
home.
goods and
They need
services with a
only
motive to
soil
earn
that will
profits
hold
and
them.
satisfy customers'
So the
needs.
engineers of Ember taught.
Businesses can be
They taught
profit
in the
or
burrow
non-profit
schools by the light of
organizations that
tallow
function to
lamps,
gain profits
drawing
or achieve a
equations in the
social
dust with
cause.
their fingers because there was no paper, teaching children who had never seen electricity the underlying logic of circuits, teaching them why a wire carries a current the way a river carries water, teaching them the shape of an atom the way their grandparents had once taught fairy tales. Because on Ember in those years, the fairy tales and the physics were the only inheritance left to give. A whole generation of human children grew up on Ember knowing the periodic table before they had ever seen a battery, understanding orbital mechanics before they had ever built anything faster than a hand-pulled sled, memorizing the mathematics of energy and matter the way other children might memorize the names of kings. And when that generation grew into adults, they did not see limitation. They saw only a very long list of things that had not yet been tried with the specific, narrow set of resources Ember actually provided. The breakthrough, when it came from an unlikely direction, and it came from Selene Ape, the girl born in the third winter who had never seen a star. By the time she was 26, Selene was the settlement's foremost expert in what the humans of Ember, with characteristically dark humor, called junk physics, the study of the strange resonant properties of Ember's native iron ore, which was laced through with trace elements the settlers had never been able to identify with the crude spectroscopy their handmade instruments allowed. Selene had noticed, almost by accident, while heating samples of the ore in an experimental kiln meant to test its usefulness for tool making, that certain crystalline formations within it appeared to flicker, for fractions of a second, in ways that made no sense according to any physics she had been taught in the Burrow schools. Objects placed near the heated ore during these flickers registered, on the settlement's single working and heavily jury-rigged magnetometer, momentary and inexplicable spikes, as if the object had, for an instant too brief to properly measure, simply not been fully present in the space it occupied. It took Selene and a team of 11 physicists, working entirely from theory and salvaged intuition with no access to any advanced instrumentation whatsoever, nearly 14 years to understand what she had actually found. What she had found, though none of them had the vocabulary for it yet, was a naturally occurring quantum tunneling amplifier, a mineral structure whose crystalline lattice, under precise thermal and electromagnetic conditions, could induce macroscopic quantum tunneling in objects placed within its resonance field, allowing matter to pass through what would otherwise be an impassable barrier of distance itself, not by traveling across the space between 2 points, but by existing, for a controlled instant, in a probabilistic superposition that included both points at once, and then collapsing that superposition by design at the far location. It was not travel in any sense the Council's engineers, wedded for 10,000 years to their vast, ponderous, and undeniably impressive gate networks, would have recognized. It did not open a door. It did not bridge a distance. It simply moved the question of where a thing was, and then answered that question differently than it had been answered a moment before. The Council's gates, built and maintained by an empire that had not meaningfully innovated its transportation infrastructure in 3 millennia, worked by anchoring 2 fixed points in space and folding the distance between them, a process that required enormous, fixed, expensive installations at both ends, installations that took decades to construct and centuries to pay off, installations that were, not coincidentally, one of the primary instruments of Council power. Since a species with no gate access was a species with no meaningful way to leave its assigned territory, the humans of Ember, lacking any gate, lacking any fixed installation at either end of anything, had instead found a way to travel without needing 2 ends at all. Their ships would not need a destination that had been prepared in advance. They would only need enough understanding of where they wished their own particular arrangement of atoms to statistically prefer to be. It is difficult to overstate how quietly this discovery arrived, and how loudly its implications would eventually roar. For the next 20 years, the humans of Ember built nothing that looked, from orbit, like a threat. The Council's monitoring satellite, still faithfully logging its dry statistical reports, recorded a settlement that had stabilized, that had grown steadily, unremarkably, from 2 million desperate survivors to nearly 9 million reasonably comfortable ones, that had developed rudimentary agriculture using engineered lichen strains and hydroponic systems built from scavenged ice and clay piping, that showed, in short, exactly the kind of slow, grinding, unthreatening subsistence recovery the Council's models had always assumed was the best a stripped and stranded species could hope for. What the satellite could not see, because the humans of Ember had learned, from bitter experience, never again to celebrate a victory where it could be watched, was what was happening far beneath the surface, in caverns dug 3 kilometers into Ember's iron-heavy crust, where the resonant ore deposits ran thick and deep enough to power something far larger than a laboratory sample. They built their first working tunneling drive in secret, in a cavern the engineers nicknamed the Forge. And it was, by any conventional standard, an ugly, brutal, overbuilt piece of machinery, welded together from scavenged ground whalebone housings and hand-woven copper coils and control systems cannibalized from 3 generations of failed prototypes. And when Selene Ape, then nearly 60 years old, finally sent a coin-sized iron test, object 17 kilometers across the cavern in less time than light itself would have needed to cross that same distance, there was no cheering. There was, instead, a long, profound silence, the whole engineering team staring at the spot where the coin had simply reappeared. And then someone began to laugh, quietly at first and then without any ability to stop. And that laughter spread through the forge like fire through dry grass, because everyone in that cavern understood, in that instant, exactly what they were holding, and exactly what it meant for the world that had thrown them away. The years between the coin and the ship were not, contrary to how the story is often compressed in the retelling, years of steady, uninterrupted progress. They were years of failure stacked on failure, of prototype drives that tore themselves apart in test chambers, scattering shards of scavenged copper and groundwheel bone across the forge, and on 3 separate occasions, killing the engineers standing nearest, because a macroscopic quantum tunneling event, done wrong, does not politely decline to happen. It simply happens somewhere slightly different than in 10. Dead and a slightly different somewhere, when the object in question is a human body, is a horror that the survivors of the Forge did not speak about for years afterward, and that Selene Ape herself, in the one interview she ever gave on the subject late in her life, described only as the tuition we paid for a lesson no one else in the galaxy was teaching. Each failure was documented with the same obsessive, unsentimental rigor the Borough schools had instilled in an entire generation. Every variable recorded, every near miss and outright catastrophe folded back into the design, until the 4th generation of prototype drives stopped tearing themselves, and their crews apart and started instead, simply working, again and again, with a reliability that the engineers of Ember, hardened by then to expect failure as the default outcome of any experiment, found almost more disorienting than the failures had been. It took another 11 years to go from a coin across a cavern to a ship across a solar system, and another 9 after that to build a drive stable enough and large enough to carry a crewed vessel across the true, galaxy-spanning distances the humans of Ember intended, eventually, to cross. In those 2 decades, the humans of Ember built not one fleet but 3 generations of fleet, each obsolete before it was finished because the engineers, freed at last from the tyranny of scarcity that had once forced every design decision, kept discovering better ways to do everything. And it is in the description of this fleet, the one that finally crossed the dark and arrived in the sky above Thren Prime, that the true scale of what 50 years of exile had built becomes impossible to overstate. The ships of the human armada were nothing like the vessels the Council's own war doctrine assumed an emerging species would build. The Council's own ships, and the ships of every species that had joined the Council's order over the preceding 10 millennia, were built in the old style, vast, crystalline, grown rather than assembled, hulls of laboratory-cultured silicate that shimmered in starlight like cut gemstones, elegant and beautiful, and crucially, unchanged in their fundamental design philosophy for longer than human civilization itself had existed. They were built to be seen, built to convey the ancient, unhurried, unquestionable authority of a government that had never once in 10,000 years faced a serious internal challenge to the order it had established. They glittered. They caught the light. They had been, for 10 millennia, the single most awe-inspiring thing any young species encountered upon first entering Council space, and that awe had always been the point. The human ships glittered at nothing. They were built dark on purpose, hulls of layered composite grown from Ember's own iron-rich rock, blackened and treated until they drank in light rather than reflecting it, because the engineers of Ember, hardened by 50 years of learning that visibility is vulnerability, had built a fleet meant to be felt rather than admired. Where the crystalline ships of the Council curved in soft, grown, organic arcs, the human ships were sharp, angular, built from hard, deliberate lines that looked less like art and more like a closed fist. And threaded through that obsidian geometry ran veins of cold, pulsing blue-white light, the visible signature of the tunneling drives idling beneath the hull. Light that did not illuminate so much as it seemed to breathe, slow and even, like something patient and enormous drawing a long, calm breath before it spoke. The flagship, the vessel Naomi Voss commanded, and which the crew had named with the particular black humor that Ember had bred into an entire species, the second verdict, was 3 kilometers of that dark, breathing geometry, and it moved, when it moved at all in real space, with a silence that unsettled every sensor operator in Council space, because their instruments had been calibrated for 10,000 years to detect the telltale flare of reaction drives and the slow, majestic unfolding of gate fields, and they had absolutely no idea what to do with a fleet of 73 ships that simply arrived, all at once, without ever having been detected leaving anywhere at all. It is worth dwelling, too, on what it cost to build that fleet, because the human engineers never forgot, not for one day of those 50 years, that they were building it with their bare, cracked, calloused hands in caverns lit by scavenged tallow and later by crude fusion lanterns of their own devising, in temperatures that regularly dropped low enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Using tools that had themselves been built by tools that had themselves been built by the first crude stone hammers the survivors carried out of that first, brutal winter. Every rivet in the hull of the second verdict had been placed by a person who remembered, or had been raised by someone who remembered exactly what it felt like to be told by an ancient and powerful civilization that you were not fit to exist among the stars. Every coil of the tunneling drive had been wound by hands that had once, or whose parents had once, scraped poisonous purple lichen off cavern walls just to survive one more week. The fleet was not simply advanced. It was 50 years of grief, refined by rage, tempered by patience, and finally, only finally, shaped by hope into something that could fly. There were 73 ships in the formation that finally departed Ember's shattered, iron-rich crust, and no 2 of them were quite alike, because the shipwrights of Ember, unlike the crystalline growers of the Council's ancient yards, had never had the luxury of a single unbroken tradition to build within, and so each vessel carried the particular signature of whichever decade, whichever cavern, whichever desperate engineering crisis had produced it. The oldest ships in the fleet, squat and heavily reinforced, bore the scars of the earliest, most brutal tunneling failures in their very design philosophy. Thick, redundant hulls wrapped 3 times over around drives their builders had not yet fully trusted. The newest ships, sleeker, longer, their obsidian hulls tapering to points so fine they looked, in the right light, like something drawn rather than built, carried drives so refined that their idle hum, audible only as a faint vibration through a boot sole pressed to the deck, had become, among the crews who served aboard them, something close to a lullaby. The second verdict herself sat between these 2 extremes, old enough to carry the memory of the forge's early failures in the bones of her design, new enough to outrun and outmaneuver anything the Council's yards had produced in the preceding 3,000 years. And it was this combination, the ancient caution married to the newest ambition, that Naomi Voss had insisted on when she chose her flagship, because she wanted every officer aboard to remember, every single day of the voyage, exactly what the fleet had cost to build, and exactly how far it had traveled to arrive at what it had finally become. The engineers of Ember had also spent no small amount of those final years wrestling with a problem the Council, with its ancient and unchanging gate network, had simply never needed to solve. The psychological weight, on a human crew, of a form of travel that did not feel like travel at all. A gate journey, however the Council's engineers dressed it up in elegant crystalline architecture, was at least experientially continuous, a slow, comprehensible unfolding of one place into another. The tunneling drive offered no such comfort. A crew stepping into the drive's resonance field experienced, by every account ever recorded, an instant of total sensory absence, not darkness, not silence, but the complete cessation of any sensation at all, followed immediately by the abrupt, disorienting return of a body and a universe that had, in the space of that absence, simply relocated itself across a distance that light itself would need years to cross. Early crews on Ember had described the experience as being, for one immeasurable instant, nothing at all, and it had taken the Forge's physicians nearly as long to develop the training protocols that let a human mind tolerate that instant without lasting psychological harm as it had taken the engineers to build the drives themselves. Protocols built around meditation, around the Burrow School's old habit of reciting memorized truths to steady a frightened mind. So that by the time Naomi Voss's crews stepped into the second verdict's drive field on the day of the crossing, each of them carried, silently repeated in the instant before the world disappeared, some small private anchor of memory, a parent's name, a line of old earth poetry salvaged from a grandparent's recollection, a fragment of the same 3 sentences Elias Voss had once told his daughter at the mouth of their cavern home. Naomi Voss had grown up inside that grief the way other children grow up inside a house, so thoroughly surrounded by it that, for years, she did not recognize it as anything other than the ordinary texture of the world. She remembered her father, in the years before he died quietly, of an illness the Burrow City's early medicine could not yet treat, sitting with her at the mouth of their cavern home on the rare clear nights when Ember's thin atmosphere allowed a handful of the galaxy's dimmer stars to bleed weakly through the rim's obscuring dust, and telling her, again and again, the same 3 sentences, until she knew them the way other children know a lullaby. We did not fall. We are not falling. We will not fall. He had died believing those sentences, but not living to see them proven, and it was that unfinished proof, more than any equation Selene Ape ever solved, that Naomi Voss carried with her into the officer academies, the survivors' boo. Ilt in their 4th decade of exile, and carried with her still, standing at the observation rail of the second verdict, watching Thren Prime's jeweled cities scroll slowly beneath her. The Council, for its part, reacted to the sudden appearance of 73 unidentified vessels in exactly the way 10,000 years of unchallenged authority had trained it to react, with a slow, procedural, almost comically bureaucratic escalation that assumed, right up until the moment it became impossible to assume any longer, that whatever was happening could be handled through the correct application of established protocol. The first response was a diplomatic hail, broadcast on the standard first contact frequencies, requesting that the unidentified vessels identify themselves and state their business in Council space, a request that went, for 11 full minutes, entirely unanswered, not because the humans could not respond, but because Naomi Voss had specifically ordered silence, wanting the Council to sit inside that silence a little longer, to feel, for the first time in 10,000 years, the particular discomfort of not being immediately, automatically obeyed. The second response, when the silence stretched past what Council protocol classified as an acceptable diplomatic delay, was the scramble order. The Thren Sector Defense Armada, 412 vessels of the old crystalline design, the largest standing military force the Council maintained anywhere along the galactic core, was ordered to full readiness and deployed in a broad defensive crescent between the unidentified fleet and the sacred, ancient, untouched capital world below. It was, in the estimation of every Council admiral who had ever studied military doctrine, an overwhelming and decisive show of force, 412 ships against 73, a ratio that had never, in 10,000 years of Council military history, failed to produce an immediate and total surrender from any species foolish enough to test it. What happened next is the part of the story that the surviving Council officers would spend the rest of their careers trying, and failing, to adequately explain to their superiors, because what happened next did not fit into any category their doctrine had a name for. The human fleet did not retreat. It did not return fire. It did not, in fact, do anything that any sensor operator in the Thren Sector Defense Armada could initially detect at all. And then, in the space of a single held breath, the entire human formation was simply gone from where it had been and reassembled, with the same eerie, silent precision, in a perfect, deliberate ring completely encircling the crystalline armada that had been sent to intercept it, close enough that individual gunnery officers aboard the Council ships could see. Through their own viewports, the cold blue veins pulsing along the black hulls of ships that occupied space their own targeting systems still, for several agonizing seconds, insisted were 300,000 kilometers away. There had been no visible transit, no gate flare, no drive wake, no gravitational disturbance of any kind that the Armada's instruments, the finest sensor suites the Council's 10,000-year engineering tradition had ever produced, could register as having occurred at all. The human fleet had simply, impossibly, been in one place and then in another, a maneuver that should have required them to somehow already be there. And it was in this single, devastating demonstration, more than in any weapon fired or any word spoken, that 412 Council warships and every soul aboard them understood, all at once, with the particular vertigo of a species realizing its entire model of the universe has been quietly incomplete for its entire existence, that the balance of power between the Council and the species it had exiled 50 years ago had not merely shifted. It had inverted entirely, and it had done so without a single shot being fired, without a single life being lost, without the humans ever once raising their voice above the volume of a demonstration. Aboard the Eternal Certainty, in the moments before the encirclement completed, the ship's own sensor officer, a young crystalline technician named Vral Osanith who had trained his entire short professional life on doctrine that assumed a 3-second minimum detection window for any vessel larger than a shuttle, would later testify, in a report the Council's military archive would classify, and then, decades afterward, quietly declassify as a footnote to a much larger reassessment of galactic power. That his instruments had shown him nothing at all, not a flicker, not a shadow, not the faintest gravitational ripple, right up until the moment 73 ships were simply present around his formation, arranged with a precision that suggested they had rehearsed the maneuver 1,000 times in the dark of some cavern none of his people would ever be permitted to see. He described the feeling, in that report, not as fear exactly, though fear was certainly present, but as something closer to vertigo, the specific disorientation of a mind built on 10,000 years of one set of physical assumptions, suddenly confronted with proof that those assumptions had never been the only ones available, merely the only ones his civilization had ever needed to discover. Admiral Threll Kosvaran, commanding the Thren Sector Defense Armada from the bridge of the crystalline flagship Eternal Certainty, a name that would feel, by the end of that day, almost unbearably ironic to everyone who had ever spoken it aloud, gave the only order his training had prepared him to give in a situation his training had never once imagined. He ordered all batteries to hold fire, and he opened, personally, a direct channel to the human flagship, his 4 crystalline manipulator limbs trembling with a species-specific tremor that in his people signified something between fear and profound intellectual disorientation, an emotion his own language had a word for that translated, roughly, as the moment a certainty breaks. Naomi Voss took the channel standing, her hands still loose at her sides, and when Admiral Kosvaran's translated voice filled the bridge of the second verdict, brittle and formal and audibly strained, asking by what right an exiled and technologically stripped species dared to violate Sovereign Council space with an unregistered and clearly weaponized fleet, Naomi allowed herself, for the first time since the encirclement maneuver had completed, the smallest and most deliberate of smiles. Because her father had also taught her that the most devastating answer to a threat is very often the plain, unhurried truth. "We are not here to violate anything, Admiral," she said, and her voice, translated instantly into the clicking, resonant cadence of the Council's official tongue, carried across every bridge in the crystalline armada, and moments later, through the leaked channel that Council protocol officers would spend the next several hours frantically and unsuccessfully trying to contain, across every open comm relay in Council space. 50 years ago, this Council stripped my people of every tool we had built and left us on a world with no atmosphere worth breathing, no metal we did not have to claw from the rock with our own hands, and no light in our sky at all, and you called it mercy. We did not come back today to punish you for that. We did not come back to conquer you, or to take from you even 1/10 of what was taken from us. We came back because my father once told your Council, on the day they exiled him, that you would one day have to answer for what you assumed we were, and I have brought 73 ships across the entire width of this galaxy, in less time than it takes your own gates to charge a single jump, to make sure that day has finally arrived. The silence that followed, broadcast now to every listening post in Council space, was the second silence of that day that would be studied, replayed, and argued over by historians of a dozen species for generations to come. And it was into that silence that Naomi Voss gave the order that would define humanity's return more completely than any weapon ever could have. She ordered the entire human fleet to power down every visible weapon system, to extinguish every offensive emitter, and to simply hold position, dark and patient and encircling, doing nothing at all except existing, undeniably, impossibly, in a place the Council had been certain for 50 years that humanity would never again have the power to reach. It was Selene Ape, watching from the second verdict science deck at the age of 81, having lived to see the coin cross the cavern and the ship cross the galaxy both, who first suggested, half in jest, that the human fleet ought to mark the occasion the way the very earliest human explorers had once marked the maps of unknown coastlines, and it was that half-joke, repeated down the command chain and taken up with startling sincerity by a crew who understood exactly what it meant to arrive somewhere that had once told you your existence was not permitted, that led to the small, strange, deeply human gesture for which this story is remembered above all others in the mythology that would grow up around that day. Because it was not Naomi Voss who did what came next, and it was not any of her senior officers. It was a young weapons technician named Tomas Ferreira, 26 years old, born on Ember, who had grown up in the Burrow schools memorizing equations by tallow light, and had never once, before this mission, seen an unfiltered star with his own eyes, and who asked his commander, with the particular boldness that Ember seemed to breed into its young the way certain soils breed particular flowers, for permission to do something that was not, strictly, part of any tactical protocol at all. Tomas Ferreira had brought with him, folded into his kit in defiance of at least 3 separate regulations, a small case of paints his grandmother had mixed by hand from Ember's own mineral pigments, ochres and iron blacks, and a startling, luminous blue drawn from a rare cavern lichen that glowed faintly in darkness. Paint she had given him with the instruction, only half explained even to herself, that he should use them, if he ever found somewhere worth marking. And so, in the hours after the Council's Thren Sector defense armada stood down its weapons, in the hours while the Council's diplomatic corps scrambled to assemble an emergency session to determine how precisely one negotiates with a species one had assumed for 50 years was already dead, Tomas Ferreira climbed into a small, unarmed observation shuttle, requested and received permission to exit the second verdict's hangar, and drifted a short distance from the flagship's dark hull into open space, where the true, unfiltered light of the galaxy's core, thick with more visible stars than any human being born on Ember had ever seen in one sky at once, poured through his viewport in a flood so overwhelming that the shuttle's own recording log shows a full 90 seconds in which he did not move at all, simply sat, motionless, weeping, in front of a sky his grandparents had told him in the dark of the Burrow cities was only a story. And then, with the small case of hand-mixed pigments balanced on his knee, using a thin sheet of salvaged composite as his canvas because there was, even now, no true paper anywhere in the human fleet, Tomas Ferreira painted the stars, badly by his own later admission, the proportions wrong, the colors approximate, the whole composition the unpolished work of a young man who had trained as a weapons technician and not an artist, but painted them all the same. Every visible point of light he could see through that viewport, rendered in ochre and iron black and that faint, glowing lichen blue, because he had grown up being told they were a legend, and he had decided, alone in that shuttle, that legends deserve to be witnessed properly, with one's own hands at least once. It was this image, more than the encirclement maneuver, more than Naomi Voss's speech, more than any strategic or military dimension of the day's events, that the news services of a dozen council-aligned worlds would fixate on in the weeks that followed, because it was somehow more unsettling to the Council's ancient sense of order than any display of overwhelming force could have been. A species that had been stripped of everything, exiled to a lightless corner of the galaxy, and left to die, had not merely survived. It had not merely rebuilt itself into a power capable of humbling the Council's greatest armada without firing a shot. It had, in the very first hours of its return, produced a young man who, given the chance to do anything at all with his newfound freedom, had chosen to sit alone in the dark and paint the sky, simply because he had never been allowed to see it before. And the story of that painting, copied and recopied, described and redescribed across 100 worlds' worth of news feeds, did something that no display of the fleet's terrifying capabilities ever could have. It made humanity, in the eyes of a galaxy that had spent 50 years believing them extinct, unmistakably, undeniably, and rather uncomfortably alive. The emergency council session convened 6 hours after the fleet's arrival, in the same chamber, beneath the same crystalline dome, where Ambassador Elias Voss had once stood and delivered the words the council had dismissed as an emotional outburst. And it was into that chamber, at the head of a small honor delegation that included Selene Ape, now the oldest and most decorated engineer humanity had ever produced, and Tomas Ferreira, still faintly reeking of the shuttle's recycled air and clutching. Against every protocol officer's frantic objection, his rough little painting of the stars that Naomi Voss walked, unarmed, unarmored, wearing the simple dark uniform of the fleet she
Business
commanded,
is an
to
economic
address the
activity that
same
involves the
council,
exchange,
seated in the
purchase,
same
sale, or
crystalline
production of
chairs
goods and
that had
services with a
exiled her
motive to
people
earn
50
profits and
years
satisfy
before.
customers' needs.
The elders of the council
Businesses
were,
can
in
be
the
profit
main,
or
the
non-profit
same
organizations that
individuals or the
function to gain
direct
profits
successors
or
of the
achieve a
same
social
individuals
cause.
who had presided over the original verdict, because the crystalline species that dominated the council's oldest seats lived, on average, 4 to 6 centuries, a fact that had always struck them as evidence of their own civilizational maturity and struck the humans of Ember, once they learned it, as evidence of something closer to stagnation. A species so long-lived that it had simply stopped needing to change. Counselor Ves Ombrena Thill, the presiding elder who had personally read the original sentence of exile aloud 50 years before, sat now in the same high seat, her crystalline form catching the chamber's ambient light in the same cool, prismatic shimmer it had held 5 decades earlier. And it was to her, directly, that Naomi Voss addressed the whole of what she had come to say. 50 years ago, Naomi began, and the chamber's ancient acoustic architecture, built to carry a whisper to every seat in a hall that held 10,000 delegates, carried her voice without any need for amplification at all. You told my father that humanity was too chaotic to be trusted among the stars, too independent to be governed by the order this council has maintained for 10 millennia, and I want to begin by telling you plainly that you were not entirely wrong. We are chaotic. We do not sit easily inside hierarchies that ask us to wait our turn for 10,000 years before we are permitted to innovate. We are independent, and we have never, in the whole of our short and turbulent history, been especially good at doing what we are told simply because an authority older than us has told us to do it. You looked at those two facts 50 years ago and you saw a threat, and you exiled 11 million human beings to a world with no air worth breathing and no light in its sky, and you called that mercy, and you filed the matter closed, and you have spent 50 years since assuming that the file would stay closed forever, because that is what happens in your experience to species you exile. They do not come back. They are not supposed to be able to come back. That is, I believe, rather the point of the sentence. She paused, and in that pause, Selene Ake, standing at her side, quietly raised the small device she had carried into the chamber, a device no larger than a human hand, built from Ember's own iron-rich rock and copper and the patient labor of a woman who had spent her entire life turning nothing into something, and activated it, so that a single, small, controlled tunneling event, no larger than a coin's width, flickered soundlessly in the space above the council floor, a modest, almost gentle demonstration of the very principle that had carried 73 warships across the width of the galaxy without ever once needing a gate, a network, an installation, or the Council's permission. This, Naomi continued, gesturing to the flickering light, is what my people built in 50 years in caverns by hand, with tools we made from other tools we made from stone. We built it without your gates, without your archives, without a single piece of technology this council ever permitted us to keep. We built it because you left us nothing but our own minds, and it turns out, counselor, that our minds were never actually the threat you were afraid of. Our minds were always the thing you should have been trying to learn from, if this council had ever, in 10,000 years, been capable of learning anything at all. We are not here to conquer you. We could have arrived today with those 73 ships' weapons fully active, and your sector defense armada would never have gotten a single shot off before it was reduced to component atoms, and every strategist in this chamber knows that is not an exaggeration, because your own admiral watched us encircle 412 of your warships without your instruments ever detecting our approach. We did not do that. We chose, very deliberately, not to do that, because my father believed, and I have spent my whole life believing with him, that a species proves what it truly is not in the moment it gains the power to destroy, but in the moment it chooses, with that power fully in hand, to hold it perfectly still instead. The chamber, 10,000 delegates from dozens of council-aligned species, held a silence that the historians present would later describe as the longest recorded silence in the chamber's 4,000-year history. And it was into that silence that Councillor Vess Ombrena Thill, for the first time in the memory of anyone living, rose from the high seat before the full council had voted to permit it. An act so far outside 10,000 years of established protocol that 3 separate protocol officers would later resign, rather than record it as anything other than what it plainly was. An admission, offered without the shelter of a formal ruling, that the ancient order the council had maintained since before humanity had learned to write, was no longer the only order the galaxy needed to reckon with. We assumed, Councillor Thill said, and her voice, when it finally came, carried none of the cool, prismatic certainty it had carried 50 years before, that a species left with nothing would become nothing. It was not malice, Commander Voss. It was, I believe now, something worse than malice. It was the particular blindness of a civilization that has not needed to imagine failure in so long that it has forgotten failure is not the only possible outcome of hardship. We did not exile your people because we were certain you were dangerous. We exiled you because we were certain you would not survive to prove us wrong, and it was easier in that certainty to call the sentence mercy than to call it what it actually was, which was cowardice dressed in the language of caution. It is here, in the aftermath of that admission, that most retellings of the story choose to end, with the image of the ancient council chastened and the new form vindicated, and it is a satisfying place to end. But it is not, in fact, where the true story of that day concluded, because Naomi Voss had not crossed the width of the galaxy simply to receive an apology, however sincere, from a body that had needed 50 years, and an armada it could not detect to finally offer one. She had come, as she told the chamber in the closing minutes of her address, to offer something the council had never once, in 10,000 years of presiding over the fates of younger species, thought to offer any of them in return. A choice, freely given, about what came next. "You do not need to fear us," Naomi told the chamber, as Tomas Ferreira stood quietly at her side, his rough painting of the stars now resting, at Selene Ape's quiet insistence, on the small pedestal before the council's high seat, where it would remain, framed and preserved, for the rest of the council's existence as a reminder of exactly what had been dismissed as unfit 50 years before. "We are not here to take your gates, your worlds, or your ancient order away from you, because unlike this council, we do not believe that the only way to prove a thing's worth is to take away everything another thing has built. What we ask instead is simple. We ask that this council formally and permanently rescind the sentence of exile passed against my people 50 years ago, not because we require your permission to exist, since we have rather thoroughly demonstrated today that we do not, but because the record of that sentence should not be allowed to stand unchallenged in your archives as evidence that our fate was ever actually in your hands to decide. And we ask further that the Council open its gate network to human trade and travel on the same terms it offers every other member species, not as a gift, and not as an apology, but as a simple, overdue correction to a mistake that cost 2 million human lives in its first year alone. In exchange, we offer this council the same choice we were once denied, the chance to learn from a species this chamber called too chaotic to be trusted, before that chance, too, quietly closes. The vote to rescind the sentence of exile passed the full council chamber later that same day, unanimously, a result so far outside historical precedent that it was, for weeks afterward, the single most discussed political event across every world in council space. And in the years that followed, the human fleet that had arrived in dark, silent, angular splendor above Thren Prime became, gradually and against every expectation the council had once held, not a conquering force but a trading partner, a scientific collaborator, and, in the particular and specific case of the tunneling drive technology that Selene Ake eventually agreed, on terms she herself dictated, to share with a small consortium of council engineers who had spent their careers unlearning 10,000 years of assumptions about how travel between the stars was supposed to work. Something the ancient galaxy had not encountered in longer than its oldest crystalline elders could remember. A genuine, uncomfortable, and ultimately invaluable disruption to an order that had mistaken its own stillness for wisdom. Tomas Ferreira's painting remained on that pedestal in the council chamber, and in the years that followed, it became tradition among the council's own young diplomatic officers, before their first formal address to the full chamber, to pause before it, this rough, imperfect, hand-mixed rendering of a sky one exiled young man had never been allowed to see, and it became slowly, without anyone ever declaring it so by vote or decree, the single most reproduced image in the Council's 4,000-year archive. Copied onto 1,000 worlds, translated into languages that had no prior word for the specific, aching gratitude of seeing something for the first time after being told, your whole life, that it was only a story. Historians would later note the peculiar fact that it was not the 73 warships, nor the encirclement of an armada 412 ships strong, nor even Naomi Voss's address to the full council, that came to define humanity's return in the collective memory of the wider galaxy, but that small, badly proportioned painting of the stars, because it captured something the council's ancient order, for all its crystalline grandeur, had never once had the occasion to feel. The particular, overwhelming wonder of a species that had been told the universe was closed to it, discovering, lone in the dark, that it was not. In the months that followed, Ember itself changed, though not as quickly or as completely as some of the younger crew, giddy on the fumes of vindication, had hoped. The borough cities did not empty out overnight into gleaming new towers. The humans who had built a civilization out of rock and rage were, by temperament and by hard experience, suspicious of anything that came too easily. And so the first council engineers permitted to visit Ember, arriving cautiously, almost apologetically, aboard a modest human shuttle rather than any vessel of their own, found a people who received their awed curiosity with a courtesy that was warm but never quite unguarded, the courtesy of a species that had learned, the hardest possible way, exactly how much an outsider's good opinion was actually worth. Selene Ape, in her final working years, insisted on personally supervising every technical exchange between human and council engineers, not out of possessiveness, she said, but because she had watched an entire civilization once decide her people's fate from a great and comfortable distance, and she meant to make certain that whatever new relationship grew between the two peoples was built, this time at eye level, in the same rooms, over the same tables, with no one permitted to simply file a verdict and walk away. Tomas Ferreira, for his part, never returned to weapons systems work. He spent the remaining decades of his career as an artist, of all things, an unlikely and faintly embarrassed career he had never planned for and never quite got used to, traveling between Ember and a dozen council worlds to paint, properly this time, with real pigments and real canvas, the skies that 100 different species took for granted, and it became a quiet tradition, wherever he traveled, for children of that world, human or otherwise, to sit beside him while he worked and ask him always to tell them the story of the first time he had seen the stars, a story he told, by his own account, several thousand times over the course of his life, and never once, he said, in quite the same way twice, because the wonder in it never fully wore smooth no matter how many times he turned it over. Naomi Voss served as humanity's first formal ambassador to the Council for 11 years after that day, a position her father had held only long enough to be exiled from it, and in her closing address before stepping down, delivered in the same chamber beneath the same dome, she said only this: that her people had not returned to prove the Council wrong, though they had certainly done that, and they had not returned for revenge, though the temptation, in the darkest years of Ember's exile, had been real and had been resisted with real, deliberate effort. They had returned, she said, because her father had once told her that the deepest injury of the exile was never the hunger or the cold or the darkness, but the accusation buried inside the sentence itself, the claim that a chaotic, independent, unfinished species had no place among the stars, and humanity, she said, had spent 50 years in the dark building the only answer that had ever mattered to that accusation, not a weapon, and not an empire, but simply, stubbornly, undeniably, a future, and they had carried that future back across the width of the galaxy to lay it, gently and without malice, on the table of the very council that had once been so certain it would never exist at all. And somewhere in the archives of a council chamber that had stood for 4,000 years without trembling, a small, badly painted image of the stars hung framed above the seats of elders who had once believed their order was the only order the universe required, a reminder, quiet and permanent, that the deepest lesson of that long, dark exile was never that humanity had learned to fold space, or split atoms, or build a fleet that could vanish from one point in the galaxy and reappear unannounced, encircling an armada in absolute silence. The deepest lesson was smaller than that, and stranger, and it belonged, in the end, not to the physicists or the admirals, but to a young man who had never seen a star, sitting alone in a shuttle with a case of hand-mixed paint on his knee, discovering that the thing he had been told his whole life was only a legend was, in fact, simply waiting, patiently, for someone to finally look. That, in the end, is the part of the story humanity chose to keep telling, long after the treaties were signed and the trade routes opened, and the old crystalline order settled, however uneasily, into a galaxy that finally had to make room for something it had once thrown away. Not the ships, not the silence they moved in, or the impossible speed that had made an ancient armada's every instrument lie to it at once. just a boy with a box of paint he was never supposed to bring, sitting in the dark, finally looking up.